He walked into the supermarket on a regular afternoon, the kind where the sun was shining just enough to make the day feel calm, and the streets outside hummed with quiet life. Inside, the air smelled of fresh bread and ripe fruit. People were pushing carts, browsing shelves, calling out to each other, or checking off lists they had scribbled down earlier. He was just another face among the crowd, moving through the aisles with purpose but without hurry. His eyes scanned the shelves, not because he was looking for anything in particular, but because he liked to see what people were buying, to watch the quiet rhythm of everyday life. He had his list in his pocket, but it wasn't the kind of list that demanded strict adherence. It was more like a guide to the things that would make the week easier. Maybe a loaf of bread here, a carton of eggs there. Perhaps some fruit that looked fresh enough to make breakfast feel a little brighter. He stopped at the bread section first, running a hand over the loaves, turning them gently, checking the texture. A woman nearby smiled at him as she reached for a baguette, and he nodded back, appreciating the simple kindness of strangers who didn't know anything about each other beyond the moment. Meanwhile, someone else entered the store. He wore a uniform, the kind that gave people an immediate sense of authority, the badge catching the light in a small, sharp glint. His presence shifted the atmosphere slightly, though most shoppers didn't notice. They were wrapped up in their own worlds, their own tasks. But he noticed. He noticed the way the uniformed officer's eyes swept across the aisles, the way his gaze lingered a little too long, the slight tension in his posture. There was something in the way the officer moved, the way he carried himself that didn't belong to the rhythm of this ordinary afternoon. It felt off. The officer paused near the entrance to the bread aisle, scanning the crowd as if searching for someone. He stopped briefly, looking around, narrowing his eyes. There was an intensity in that look, a focus that seemed to pick out the ordinary and twist it into suspicion. He moved with deliberate steps, each one measured, precise, almost rehearsed, like a dance that only he knew the steps to. He didn't see the smiles, the casual greetings, the mundane movement of people living their lives. He only saw shapes and shadows, someone who didn't belong in his perception. He reached for a loaf of bread, turning it in his hands, trying to enjoy the mundane task, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping in the back of his mind. He noticed the officer's gaze occasionally flicking in his direction, lingering longer than it should, and he felt a tightening in his chest. It was subtle at first, just a shadow of tension, but it grew with each step the officer took closer to the aisle where he stood. The air felt heavier, like the sunlight outside had dimmed without anyone noticing. People moved past, carrying baskets, pushing carts, smiling at children who ran ahead of their parents. A man reached for a jar of peanut butter and knocked over a small stack of cereal boxes, muttering an apology as he bent to pick them up. It was the kind of small, everyday disruption that usually went unnoticed, but in the moment it heightened his awareness. Every sound seemed sharper, every movement slightly exaggerated. His heart beat a little faster, not out of fear yet, but from the awareness that something was wrong, something that didn't fit the ordinary pattern of a normal day. The officer's steps were deliberate, but his eyes carried something heavier than mere caution. They carried judgment, a readiness to see threat where there was none, to interpret calm and normal as suspicious. He reached the aisle and paused, pretending to examine a product while keeping his gaze fixed on him. He could feel the intensity, the kind that made people flinch even if they didn't understand why. He kept his hands visible, touching the bread, flipping it over, nodding quietly to himself, all the while aware of the officer's watchful eyes. It wasn't a glance or a passing observation. It was a stare that tried to read him like an open book, but he wasn't a book anyone could read. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising tension. He reminded himself that it was just a supermarket, just a place where people bought food and went about their lives. The world outside waited, and he had errands to run. He picked up a loaf of bread and moved to the checkout line, hoping the movement and distraction of other shoppers would ease the unease building inside him. But as he approached, he noticed that the officer had moved again, keeping a careful distance, a shadow that followed his steps with unnatural precision. There was no casuality in it, no accident. This was a calculated presence, one that made the ordinary act of grocery shopping feel suddenly charged with an invisible tension. He placed the bread on the conveyor belt, trying to maintain a calm exterior. The cashier smiled politely, scanning the items, chatting about the weather. He smiled back, nodding along, but his eyes couldn't help flicking to the officer who had stopped nearby, ostensibly looking at a display of snacks. The officer's gaze caught his for a moment longer than it should have, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. It was the kind of look that made someone aware that they were being measured, assessed, judged unfairly. He shook his head slightly, trying to dismiss it as paranoia, but the instinctual awareness didn't leave him. As he paid for the items, the officer stepped closer, too close to be a coincidence. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but he felt it as a pressing weight, like the air itself had shifted around him. He picked up his bag and moved toward the exit, hoping the open space of the parking lot would ease the tension. But the officer mirrored his movement, staying just far enough to be noticed but not far enough to appear casual. Every step he took was deliberate, measured, and he realized that this was no ordinary encounter. The supermarket, a place of calm and routine, had become the stage for something far more intense, something that wasn't meant to be understood by those not involved. Outside, the sun still shone, and the parking lot was dotted with cars and people moving between them. The ordinary sounds of the world, birds, distant traffic, the rustle of leaves, continued unabated, indifferent to the tension building in a small corner of the space. He walked toward his car, keys in hand, and kept an eye on the officer, who now paused near the entrance, watching him as he approached his vehicle. It was a gaze that said something unspoken, a readiness that felt dangerous. He reminded himself that he had training, experience, the ability to assess and respond if needed. But even with that, the unease lingered, stubborn and insistent. He opened the car door and settled inside, exhaling slowly. For a moment, he allowed himself to think it was over, that perhaps the officer would return to his shopping and leave him be. But a sense of foreboding stayed with him, an awareness that this encounter was just beginning, that the ordinary calm of the day had been pierced by something far more serious. The sunlight glinted off the metal of the shopping cart in the nearby row, a reminder that even in ordinary moments, the extraordinary could intrude without warning. He started the engine and glanced in the rearview mirror, noticing the officer still near the entrance, standing rigidly, scanning the lot. It was not casual. It was deliberate. He felt the weight of it pressing in, the unspoken hostility in a place where nothing should have existed but normal life. And as he drove away, he realized that this moment, this simple act of shopping, had become the opening of a story far larger than a routine afternoon, a story that would test the boundaries of patience, courage, and justice in ways he had never anticipated. The day seemed to stretch longer now, the sunlight filtering through the large windows of the supermarket, glinting off polished floors and stacked shelves. What had started as a normal shopping trip was turning into something far heavier, a tension that could be felt in the quiet pauses between shoppers' footsteps. The officer, still in uniform, moved with deliberate care, as if every step he took was calculated, yet something in his posture hinted at impatience, a simmering agitation just below the surface. He walked down the aisle slowly, holding his shopping list loosely in his hand. He tried to ignore the officer, focusing on the small familiar tasks of picking up items for the week, checking dates on packages, and feeling the textures of fruits and vegetables. But he could feel the gaze. It wasn't just casual observation. It was invasive, piercing, and it made him aware of every movement he made. He noticed a ripple of unease among the other shoppers, though none could pinpoint why. It was the kind of tension that you could sense more than see, the kind that made people instinctively move a little quicker or pause a little longer. The officer had stopped near the end of the aisle. His eyes were fixed, unwavering, studying him as if trying to read a story that wasn't written on his face. Every action felt scrutinized. Reaching for a carton of eggs, checking the firmness, flipping them over to read the dates, he could feel the weight of the officer's stare. It pressed down not just on him, but on the very space around him, making the ordinary feel charged. He tried to keep his breathing steady, reminding himself that he had trained for tense situations, that he could stay calm, think clearly, and act responsibly. A shopper with a small child passed between them, the child laughing and pointing at a colorful cereal box. For a moment, the normalcy of the scene helped, as though it was a small island of routine in a sea of tension. But the officer's presence was unrelenting. The laughter and chatter of the other shoppers seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet hum of unease that he couldn't shake off. He kept his hands visible, moving slowly, intentionally, while still performing the simple, everyday task of grocery shopping. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and meant to communicate calm. Then it happened. The officer took a step forward, slightly too fast, breaking the rhythm of the aisle. His hand moved toward his belt in a gesture that made everything freeze. The shoppers near them noticed the tension, the sudden stillness, as though the air had thickened and time slowed. He froze, not out of fear but out of instinct, raising his hand slightly while maintaining a calm stance. His voice, steady but firm, called out, identifying himself clearly as someone with authority, someone trained to handle difficult situations. The officer did not lower his hand. His eyes flashed, a mixture of disbelief and anger, and he muttered words under his breath that carried a weight heavier than mere suspicion. He pointed, stepping closer, his stance rigid and unyielding. The space between them seemed smaller, almost suffocating. Bystanders froze as well, some dropping items they had intended to pick up, others clutching their carts tightly, unsure of what was happening. There was a collective pause, a silent acknowledgement that something extraordinary and dangerous was unfolding. He spoke again, his tone firm but calm, repeating that he was a federal agent. He emphasized his identity, his role, hoping to break through the haze of bias and misunderstanding. The officer's expression didn't change. It hardened, as though he had already decided the narrative of what was happening. Words of caution and explanation seemed to have no effect. The officer's finger remained on the holster, a subtle but unmistakable threat, a gesture that made it clear that he was ready to escalate if he felt challenged. Nearby shoppers began to murmur quietly among themselves, their voices low but tense. Someone reached for a phone, dialing a number to call for help, their hand shaking slightly. The clerk behind the counter looked around, confusion and worry spreading across his face. He stepped forward, trying to be helpful without making the situation worse, gesturing toward the officer and the man he was pointing at. The atmosphere thickened further, each heartbeat echoing in the small space between the shelves. He remained calm, taking slow, deliberate breaths. He reminded himself to keep his movements smooth and predictable, to avoid sudden gestures that could be misinterpreted. He shifted his weight gently, making sure his hands stayed visible. He spoke again, clearly and evenly, explaining the situation to those around, trying to maintain a sense of order in the chaos that was building. The officer's gaze never wavered, his stance unrelenting, the tension like a live wire connecting them in the middle of the aisle. A few employees, seeing the danger, called out for help, directing attention to the manager on duty. The manager arrived quickly, trying to assess the situation while keeping a safe distance. He spoke loudly but calmly, asking everyone to step back and giving instructions that were simple and clear. The presence of another authority figure seemed to have little immediate effect on the officer, whose focus remained entirely on the man standing calmly in front of him. Then, for a brief moment, the officer's hand wavered slightly, a micro-expression of uncertainty. It lasted only a second, but it was enough for the man to notice. He took that moment to keep speaking in calm tones, explaining his position and trying to de-escalate the situation verbally. Every word was carefully chosen, every tone measured, intended to reach some part of the officer that was still connected to reason, to humanity. But the officer's expression remained hard, his stance ready, and the bystanders could feel the danger lingering in the air, palpable and heavy. The tension stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Shoppers moved cautiously, some leaving their carts behind, some ducking behind shelves, all aware that a simple mistake could escalate the situation further. The officer shifted slightly, adjusting his stance, and the movement created a ripple of awareness through the small crowd. Eyes followed every motion, hearts pounded with anticipation, and the air seemed to vibrate with uncertainty. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just about an encounter at a supermarket. It was about control, about assumptions, about the invisible weight of prejudice and bias. He felt a sense of responsibility, not just for himself but for everyone around, for the quiet bystanders whose lives were being touched by this tension without choice. He continued to speak, continued to project calm, projecting confidence that was meant to stabilize not only himself but the entire space. Suddenly, the officer took a small step closer, his eyes narrowing further. The gap between them felt charged, the world around reduced to the narrow space of the aisle, to the echo of their breathing, to the silent pulse of fear and awareness. The shoppers nearby could feel the invisible line, the tension that defined the boundaries of safety and danger. They instinctively moved back, some whispering, some frozen in place, all feeling the pressure of the moment. He adjusted his stance slightly, keeping his voice steady, careful not to escalate the situation further. He recognized the officer's gestures, the subtleties of body language that suggested readiness to act. He countered it with calm movements, with verbal clarity, with an awareness that his reaction could either calm or inflame the situation. Every decision was deliberate, measured, intentional. The officer's hand hovered over the holster, a silent declaration of potential violence while he remained as composed as possible, projecting calm in a space that was anything but calm. It was a delicate balance, a negotiation of human behavior, bias, and fear. He understood the weight of the moment, the fragility of control, and the thin line that separated resolution from disaster. Minutes felt like hours, and every second brought an increasing awareness of how quickly things could go wrong. Yet he did not panic. He kept speaking, explaining, and maintaining the rhythm of calm and clarity. He noticed the subtle movements of bystanders, the slight shifting of employees trying to keep the situation under observation. Everything became a part of the pattern, a complex dance of tension and caution, with the hope that reason would prevail. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the officer paused, the weight of his gaze lingering, his posture still rigid, but a faint trace of hesitation appearing. The small flicker of uncertainty was all that stood between the potential for escalation and the chance for a controlled resolution. He continued to speak calmly, to reinforce that no one needed to be harmed, that the situation could end peacefully. The subtle shifts in body language, the careful choice of words, and the conscious projection of calm all worked together to keep the moment from tipping into chaos. In that aisle, surrounded by ordinary shelves, ordinary products, and ordinary people going about their daily lives, the encounter stretched into a quiet but tense standstill. It was a confrontation that carried more weight than the supermarket itself, a test of patience, courage, and the ability to maintain composure under direct threat. And in that moment he understood something important. Sometimes the most ordinary places could become the setting for extraordinary courage, where calm and humanity could stand against tension and prejudice, and where the smallest actions could define the difference between escalation and peace. The tension in the supermarket had reached a point where every sound felt amplified. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant beep of scanners, even the faint shuffle of shoes against tile seemed to echo through the aisle. People had stopped moving, frozen mid-step, unsure whether to flee or stay. Some clutched their carts tightly, while others pressed their hands to their mouths in shock. The air felt thick, almost heavy, as though the space itself was holding its breath. He remained calm, keeping his hands visible and his voice steady. Each word he spoke was deliberate, meant to explain, reassure, and de-escalate. He knew that panic could spread quickly, that fear could escalate a situation faster than any misunderstanding. Around him, shoppers whispered to each other, some dialing phones, while others tried to find a safe distance. The cashier had stepped back from the register, his eyes wide, and the manager was moving cautiously between the aisles, trying to see what was happening without getting caught in the confrontation. The officer's stance remained rigid, his finger still near the holster, his eyes never leaving him. The intensity of the gaze, combined with the threat implied by the weapon, made every movement feel magnified. He could sense that the officer's mind was already building a narrative, interpreting ordinary actions as something suspicious. It was a tense dance of perception and assumption, one that could spiral out of control with the slightest misstep. He decided to speak again, projecting calm and clarity, addressing not only the officer but also the people around them. He explained who he was, the role he held, and why he was there. His words were clear and measured, without accusation, without panic, with the aim of cutting through misunderstanding and fear. He watched the officer carefully, noting micro-expressions, subtle shifts in weight, and slight changes in tone that might indicate a moment of hesitation. Every gesture mattered. Every syllable had weight. Around them, the supermarket was alive with muted chaos. Shoppers edged toward exits. Employees tried to maintain a sense of order, and the small crowd that had gathered near the aisles whispered and gestured, caught between curiosity and fear. There was a tension in the air that made ordinary tasks feel impossible. The sound of a dropped jar rolling across the floor made hearts jump, as did the accidental brush of a cartwheel against a shelf. Each small disruption felt magnified in the pressure cooker of the moment. He remained steady, taking slow, deliberate breaths, aware of every detail. He noticed a mother crouching to calm her child, who had started to cry out of confusion and fear. He saw an elderly man gripping his cane tightly, unsure of whether to move forward or back away. He recognized that every action, no matter how small, could affect the unfolding scenario. His focus was not only on the officer, but on the entire environment, understanding that control and calm were essential to prevent escalation. The officer shifted slightly, and the movement sent a ripple of tension through the aisle. He recognized the micro-expression of uncertainty, the brief flicker of hesitation that appeared for a fraction of a second before the rigid mask returned. He took that opportunity to maintain calm, speaking slowly, explaining once more that no one needed to be hurt, that the situation could remain under control. His words were careful, emphasizing understanding, patience, and reason. Other officers arrived shortly after, responding to calls from the supermarket. Their presence added another layer of complexity, but also a chance to diffuse the tension. They moved cautiously, communicating in low tones, signaling to the officer to lower his weapon. The dynamic shifted subtly, with the newcomer officers adding authority without aggression. The officer, however, seemed resistant, his attention still fixed on him, the tension palpable and heavy. He kept his voice even, using every bit of training to guide the situation toward resolution. He acknowledged the other officers, introducing himself briefly, clarifying roles and intentions. He emphasized that cooperation and calm could prevent any harm. The surrounding crowd could feel the difference, noticing the careful communication, the deliberate effort to maintain safety. The subtle shift in tone and approach began to ripple outward, slowly easing the tension in some of the shoppers who had been frozen in fear. At one point, the officer's hand moved slightly, a subtle but unmistakable gesture that suggested readiness. He recognized it immediately, adjusting his stance to remain non-threatening yet alert. He continued speaking, blending reassurance with clarity, attempting to guide the officer's perception away from threat and toward reason. It was a delicate balance, navigating the volatile mix of authority, bias, and fear, and he maintained it with patience and precision. The manager moved closer, speaking in calm, clear instructions to the shoppers, helping them maintain distance and remain safe. The employees responded with careful attention, guiding people to exits and encouraging others to stay behind shelves if necessary. The space, while still tense, began to have structure, a quiet order amid the chaos. He noted the importance of every small action, recognizing that each effort to maintain calm could prevent disaster. Minutes passed, each one stretching long, heavy, filled with awareness and anticipation. The officer remained a constant presence, a reminder of the potential danger, but he noticed the subtle shifts that suggested hesitation. The other officers spoke quietly among themselves, coordinating a safe approach. The bystanders became slightly more relaxed as they saw control slowly returning, though the tension never fully left the space. He continued his steady, measured approach, balancing authority with calm, explaining his role, reinforcing understanding, and emphasizing that no harm needed to come to anyone. He observed micro-expressions in the officer's face, noting shifts in gaze, slight changes in posture, and the brief flickers of doubt. Every detail mattered. His awareness extended to the people around him, understanding that their perception of safety or danger could influence the officer's actions. A quiet, tense negotiation unfolded, unspoken, yet clear. Every word, every gesture, every breath had meaning. He maintained composure, projecting confidence without aggression, clarity without condescension. The officer's rigid stance remained, but the moments of hesitation grew, subtle yet present, suggesting that reason had begun to edge into the situation. The supermarket itself became a backdrop to human tension and resilience. Ordinary shelves, everyday products, and the simple act of shopping contrasted with the extraordinary moment unfolding between two people, each aware of the stakes. He realized that the space, mundane as it was, had become a place where calm, communication, and human awareness mattered more than anything else. Finally, the officer's posture shifted slightly, a micro-adjustment that indicated he was processing the situation differently. He continued speaking, emphasizing safety, reason, and patience. He noticed the bystanders' cautious movements, the slow return of everyday gestures, and understood that every word and action contributed to diffusing the tension. It was not dramatic, not cinematic, but human and real, a quiet, ongoing effort to prevent disaster. The presence of additional officers, the careful guidance of employees, and the calm projection of authority created a subtle but effective network of control. The officer's intensity did not vanish, but it began to coexist with the awareness of others and the structured approach being maintained. He continued his patient, deliberate efforts, aware that the smallest misstep could undo all progress. In that aisle, amid ordinary grocery items and the quiet murmur of shoppers, a tense standoff was unfolding, not with shouting or violence, but with awareness, caution, and human judgment. It was a confrontation defined by patience and calm, where observation, micro-gestures, and verbal clarity shaped the unfolding events. And in that moment, he understood that courage was not just about action. It was about presence, awareness, and the determination to navigate fear and bias without losing composure. The situation had reached a tipping point, and the weight of it was heavy on everyone in the supermarket. The air was thick with tension, and even the mundane sounds of the store, the beeping of the scanner, the distant rustle of shopping carts, felt sharper, almost charged. He remained calm, keeping his hands visible, speaking steadily, projecting a sense of control. He understood that the officer's actions were driven not just by misjudgment, but by a combination of authority and bias that had no place in the moment, yet shaped it completely. Other officers had arrived, moving with careful coordination. They approached the situation methodically, aware that a single mistake could escalate the confrontation. The tension between him and the officer was palpable, yet the presence of trained personnel helped create a controlled environment. Their voices were low but clear, giving instructions, signaling for calm and trying to assert order without provoking further hostility. The officer's hand still hovered near the holster, but there were small signs of hesitation. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he noticed. He continued to speak calmly, using precise words to reinforce that no one needed to be harmed. His tone was firm but not aggressive, an effort to humanize the interaction and break through the rigid walls of suspicion and bias. Shoppers had moved back to a safe distance, many crouching behind shelves or near the exits. Some had pulled out, their phones capturing the scene silently, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe. The manager moved cautiously, guiding employees and customers with calm, clear instructions. Every small action contributed to maintaining a sense of order amid the ongoing tension. He observed the officer carefully, noting micro-expressions, the shifting weight, the subtle tightening of muscles. Each movement was a potential signal, a clue to the officer's state of mind. He responded with measured gestures, careful words, and deliberate calm. It was a negotiation without spoken agreement, a silent understanding that the outcome depended on patience, awareness, and human composure. The arriving officers began speaking to the first officer, offering guidance, explaining that the situation could be resolved peacefully. They maintained a professional distance, communicating in tones that were steady but authoritative. He watched the interactions, noting how the dynamics shifted slightly with their presence. The tension was still there, but it was no longer absolute. There was now room for resolution. He continued to speak, projecting clarity and calm. He emphasized that cooperation was possible, that no one needed to be hurt, and that the situation could be resolved without escalation. His words were deliberate, steady, and repeated as necessary, reinforcing understanding. The subtle power of voice and tone became a tool to manage not only the officer's reactions, but also the surrounding environment. Around them, the supermarket continued its muted rhythm. People who had been frozen in fear slowly regained composure, their movements careful but deliberate. Employees moved cautiously, still observing the situation, while the manager worked to maintain structure. The ordinary world of grocery shopping was intersecting with an extraordinary moment of human tension, and every participant was acutely aware of it. The officer shifted slightly, a small movement, but it carried significance. He noticed the change and adjusted his own stance to remain calm and non-threatening. He continued speaking, reinforcing patience, understanding, and the possibility of peaceful resolution. The interplay of movements, gestures, and words formed a careful dance, one that balanced authority, reason, and human awareness against potential bias and aggression. The arriving officers spoke with him briefly, coordinating how to approach the officer without provoking further danger. They respected his experience and insight, understanding that his calm approach had been critical to maintaining order. Together, they formed a network of communication and control, a quiet but effective strategy to prevent escalation. Moments stretched, each one weighted with awareness. He continued his measured dialogue, acknowledging the officer's authority while asserting the need for safety and reason. Every sentence was chosen with care, every gesture deliberate. The surrounding people began to relax slightly, sensing that control was returning and that the worst outcomes could be avoided. It was a slow process relying on consistency, patience, and human presence. The officer finally lowered his hand just slightly, the micro-expression of doubt now more visible. It was a small step, but it signaled the possibility of resolution. He continued to reinforce calm, speaking clearly and gently, using the few seconds of hesitation to prevent a return to escalation. The words were simple, the tone steady, aimed at reassuring both the officer and the surrounding crowd. Other shoppers cautiously resumed movement, some whispering to each other about what had just occurred. The employees began to guide people more openly, though still with care, and the manager maintained a presence to ensure safety. The atmosphere was still charged, but the tension had begun to give way to cautious relief. Finally, the officer stepped back, lowering his posture, and the first signs of compliance became evident. He kept speaking, reinforcing patience, the importance of safety, and the possibility of cooperation. His calm and deliberate presence had helped create an opening, a moment where reason could reassert itself against suspicion and bias. The officers now approached more confidently, speaking softly to the first officer, offering guidance while maintaining safety. They worked as a team, their coordination and calm approach reinforcing the message that escalation was unnecessary and that peaceful resolution was possible. He continued to be the steady presence, a bridge between tension and safety, using his words, gestures, and awareness to guide the situation to a positive outcome. Shoppers who had initially frozen began moving cautiously toward exits, some whispering among themselves, some helping each other. The ordinary rhythm of the supermarket slowly reasserted itself, yet the memory of the tension lingered. He remained vigilant, aware that the situation was not over until the officer was safely escorted, and all parties were out of immediate danger. The manager and employees coordinated with the arriving officers, guiding people to exits and ensuring that no one was caught in potential danger. He continued to speak with calm authority, reinforcing instructions and maintaining a sense of order. The subtle influence of his steady presence helped prevent panic from spreading and reassured everyone in the immediate area. The first officer finally lowered his weapon fully, his posture relaxing, though the tension in his face was still evident. The words of the arriving officers, combined with the patient calm of the man he had confronted, had created a bridge to reason. The subtle acknowledgement of authority and understanding on both sides had allowed the situation to move from potential escalation to controlled resolution. He continued to guide the moment, ensuring that the officer was safely approached and that no sudden movements would undo the progress made. Each step was deliberate, slow, and clear. The surrounding people began to breathe a little easier, some whispering reassurances, others looking toward the exits, ready to leave once safety was assured. Finally, the officer was guided away by the arriving officers, still tense but no longer posing immediate danger. The crowd of shoppers slowly began to disperse, some leaving items behind, some moving cautiously to complete their errands. The employees and manager worked together to restore the usual rhythm of the store, though the memory of the confrontation remained. He took a moment to stand quietly, hands still visible, surveying the aisle. The space that had been filled with tension was now returning to normalcy, but the experience left a lingering awareness of how quickly ordinary moments could become extraordinary and dangerous. He acknowledged the quiet courage of the bystanders who had remained calm, and the coordinated presence of the officers who had helped prevent escalation. The situation, though resolved, left a deep impression on everyone involved. Ordinary people, caught in an extraordinary moment, had witnessed the careful balance of calm, patience, and human awareness against tension and bias. It was a reminder that courage was not always dramatic. It could be quiet, steady, and deliberate, manifested in calm words, careful movements, and thoughtful presence. He continued to speak briefly to the remaining shoppers, reinforcing safety and offering reassurance. The employees began to restock items and restore order, while the manager moved through the aisles ensuring that everyone was calm and that normal operations could resume. The ordinary rhythm of life slowly returned, though the memory of the confrontation lingered as a quiet but powerful reminder of human resilience and awareness. As he walked toward the exit, he reflected on the sequence of events, recognizing the importance of calm, deliberate action in moments of tension. The experience had tested patience, courage, and human composure, showing that ordinary people could navigate extraordinary challenges when guided by awareness, communication, and understanding. The day outside the supermarket continued, indifferent to the tension that had just passed. Yet the memory of the event would linger for everyone who had been there, a testament to the power of human presence and the importance of acting with calm and awareness in critical moments. The moment the officer was escorted from the store, a wave of relief seemed to wash over the remaining shoppers. The tension that had held the aisle in a frozen grip for so long began to dissolve, replaced by cautious sighs and quiet murmurs. People began moving again, picking up carts, checking shelves, and speaking softly to one another, as if testing the safety of the space after the charged encounter. He stayed for a moment, allowing the calm to settle, observing how ordinary life returned gradually, and noticing the small acts of kindness and support among strangers who had shared the unusual experience. Employees began restocking shelves and tidying aisles, their movements careful but steady. The manager walked slowly through the store, checking with staff and ensuring that everyone was all right. There were quiet conversations, reassurances, and moments of laughter as the tension lifted. Even the background hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft beeping of scanners felt different now, less sharp, less charged, more ordinary. The police chief reviewed the videos and reports almost immediately. He understood the gravity of the situation and the potential consequences of inaction or delayed response. After careful review, he made a decisive announcement. The officer involved was terminated for misconduct. The chief emphasized that actions driven by bias and intimidation had no place in law enforcement. The swift decision was intended to reinforce accountability, send a message about the standards expected of officers, and restore public trust. The termination was widely reported and acknowledged as a clear stance against misconduct and bias within the department. The community responded in multiple ways. Local leaders, civil rights organizations, and concerned citizens engaged in discussions about accountability, bias, and public safety. The incident became a catalyst for dialogue, encouraging reflection on how ordinary encounters can escalate and the importance of training, awareness, and human-centered approaches to conflict. Many highlighted the courage shown by the man who had faced the threat, noting how calm presence and measured action can influence outcomes even in tense, dangerous situations. He returned to his usual routine after the incident, carrying with him the lessons of patience, composure, and the power of deliberate calm. Though the experience was intense, it reaffirmed the importance of staying aware, speaking clearly, and projecting reassurance in moments of uncertainty. He understood that ordinary acts like walking calmly, keeping hands visible, and using clear communication could have extraordinary effects, preventing escalation and guiding others to safety. The bystanders who had witnessed the confrontation reflected on what they had seen. Some expressed gratitude for the calm and composed presence that had guided the situation, noting that fear could have easily spread and made the scenario far more dangerous. Others considered their own reactions, realizing how quickly ordinary environments could become stressful and the value of remaining aware and composed. The experience became a shared lesson in human resilience, awareness, and the impact of deliberate action. The terminated officer faced internal investigations and reviews, ensuring that accountability extended beyond the immediate response. The department implemented additional training and support measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. Policies were reviewed, emphasizing the importance of de-escalation, bias awareness, and professional conduct. The goal was to create a culture that prioritized safety, fairness, and human-centered approaches to policing. He continued his work, maintaining focus on his responsibilities while carrying the experience as a quiet reminder of the importance of composure and presence. The supermarket, now ordinary once again, remained a space that had witnessed extraordinary courage, patience, and human awareness. The echoes of the incident lingered not as fear, but as a testament to the power of calm, deliberate action in shaping outcomes. Community discussions continued, centering on the lessons learned from the incident. Educational programs, local meetings, and online conversations explored how bias, assumptions, and authority intersected in everyday spaces. The story of the confrontation became a reference point, illustrating how ordinary individuals, through awareness and measured action, could influence the behavior of others and prevent harm. He reflected often on the role of patience and calm in human interactions, recognizing that the skills used in moments of high tension were not only professional tools, but essential aspects of everyday life. The incident reinforced the idea that courage could take many forms, from dramatic interventions to quiet, composed presence that guided situations towards safety and resolution. It also highlighted the ripple effect of actions, showing how one person's calm response could influence many others and prevent potential harm. The aftermath included community acknowledgement of both the danger and the resolution. Local media, social platforms, and community leaders emphasized the positive outcomes achieved through calm presence, clear communication, and the professional response of officers. The story inspired discussions on accountability, training, and the importance of maintaining composure in unexpected and challenging situations. In the quiet days that followed, he returned to normal routines, but the lessons remained vivid. Every trip to a public space, every interaction with others, carried a subtle awareness of human behavior, perception, and the importance of measured action. The incident had shown him that courage was not always dramatic, that influence could be subtle, and that maintaining calm and clarity could prevent harm even in highly charged moments. The community continued to process the incident, with conversations about bias, authority, and responsibility extending beyond the supermarket. People reflected on their own behavior, on how ordinary actions could contribute to safety or risk, and on the importance of empathy, awareness, and patience in human interactions. The terminated officer's accountability served as a clear example that misconduct had consequences and that communities valued fairness and professional conduct. Through it all, he remained a symbol of quiet courage. His composed actions had not only prevented escalation, but had influenced the broader community, reinforcing lessons of awareness, calm, and human-centered presence. The story of that day, while unsettling in its potential danger, ultimately became a lesson in resilience, measured action, and the impact that ordinary people could have when facing extraordinary situations. Life gradually returned to its usual rhythm, yet the incident remained a reference point, a reminder of how quickly ordinary spaces could become charged with tension, and how deliberate, calm action could guide outcomes toward safety. He carried the experience with him, quietly aware that patience, clarity, and composure were not just professional skills but essential human tools, capable of making a difference in moments where ordinary life and extraordinary danger intersected.